right, so we have Lars Brownworth here, author of the book Lost to the West, and he did the 12 Byzantine Rulers podcast early on, which was very popular, covered by the New York Times. And more recently, he's been working on a podcast called Norman Centuries, which is not quite done yet, but will be released, will be finished rather very soon. And Lars has a new book called The Normans. And this book is in the same subject area as the newer podcast. And so we're having Lars on here to talk, and we'll ask him a little bit about that and everything and anything Byzantine and Norman and perhaps Viking. Lars, right. Welcome.
It's good to be here.
Yeah. So we're doing a Google Plus Hangout here. We will have people probably dropping in and out through this whole talk, so just it's kind of informal and casual, and we'll just be asking questions, and we'll just pepper you with questions the whole time, and hopefully you won't. Right. Hopefully you won't. You'll be able to handle them. So I think the first obvious question is, where did this come from? Where did the new book come from? It's in the same subject area as your latest podcast. So what gave you the idea, and where did it come from?
Well, I was looking for something to do after the Byzantines, and one of the attractions of the Normans is it's kind of like the Byzantine story from the opposite side. The Middle Byzantine period in particular, they fight against the Normans. The Normans are a tremendous threat to them, and it was really interesting to kind of take it from the First Crusade is the obvious sort of interaction here. To take it from Alexius Comnenus on the Byzantine side, how he handled the different Normans, Bohemond, how he fought against Robert Guiscard, how his successors did that as well. And the first time going through it, it was completely from the Byzantine perspective, and the Normans were nothing more than these very threatening, sort of half-civilized, terrifying, really, barbarians. Second time through, when I started to take a look at it through the Norman sources, they became much more interesting to me. How Guiscard was so, the Guiscard actually means crafty. And the way he was able to do what he did, he began life as a pauper. He was a younger son, I think the sixth son out of 12. He was the oldest. He had 6 half-brothers and 5 full brothers. He, obviously, the oldest son gets to keep the family plot in Normandy, and so Robert had to go looking for his fortune, and he comes down to Italy. His older brothers don't want anything to do with him. They don't really like their sort of half-brother. They're a little concerned. He's a little too ambitious, and he takes that, and just through his force of character and his wits, ends up being a duke, the equal of his contemporary Duke William the Conqueror. And then even aiming for the imperial throne. There's even a legend, or at least a thought, that he wanted to seize Constantinople for his son Bohemond, and then continue east and carve out sort of a much larger empire, kind of like Alexander the Great. Right. I think that's what he had in mind. So it's just a really interesting story. I can think of no better example of kind of the rags to riches, anything is possible mindset of that time period, and that's what really attracted me to it.
Yeah, it's the name that came to mind as you were talking there is Alexander the Great. Here's some guy that's just, his ambition seems to be well above anything you're seeing, and but it's followed up by capability as well. These guys, he seemed right. Quite scrappy, I guess, but
right. Well, that's also the interesting thing about the Normans is there's this pattern where there's a great conqueror, and they're almost always followed, if it lasts, they're almost always followed by an administrator, by a capable administrator.
Yeah.
Probably the best case, Robert Guiscard conquers Sicily with his brother Roger. And Roger, he's very careful, but he's a conqueror. They conquer Sicily. And if that had been the end of the story, he would have been one in a long line of sort of conquerors whose empire or conquest just kind of disappear afterwards. But his son, Roger II, is an unbelievable administrator who just gets down to the nuts and bolts and creates laws, and he's fascinated by the art of governing. He wouldn't have worked in the earlier generation. In fact, a lot of the nobles on the mainland don't like Roger II precisely because he's not this, smash him over the head, take it,
Yeah.
His uncle, Robert Guiscard, was bored by actually governing. He loved conquering, totally bored by governing, so he's always on to the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And what makes the Normans, I think, really extraordinary is they have both. They have those who are brilliant at conquering, and they have those who, and this is more difficult, are really brilliant at governing. And I think it's worth taking a look at how exactly they did that.
Yeah.
I find Sicily so interesting because you have if there's a definition of a fractured, sort of squabbling kingdom, it's Sicily and the south of Italy. They've got Greeks, they've got pro-Byzantine Greeks, they've got sort of native Sicilian Greeks who are interested in Sicily being its own thing. You have the Arabs of Sicily, you have Berbers in Sicily, and then you have the Normans in Sicily, and then you have Italians coming over in Sicily. They have their own sort of agendas, and Roger II has to somehow make this into a kingdom. And I think the largest measure of his success is the kingdom of Sicily that he founds is still around in the 1800s. And actually formed part of the nucleus of the modern Italian state. It's a remarkable achievement for what? A freebooting pirate. It's just what he started life as.
So you were studying the Byzantines in depth, and then you ran across these marauders that kept, banging away at the periphery of the empire, and then you said, well, let me take a look at them. You dive in, you find it much more, you find a lot there. So then you decided to do a podcast about that, and now you're writing a book about the Normans as well. That mirrors what you did with the Byzantines. You started with a podcast and then did a book. Is that kind of the way you're going to go? Is that the way you think you'd like to take on subjects?
I mean, honestly, to this point, it's kind of been fortuitous that's the way it worked out. I think there is merit to that. You see if the story kind of has legs, and you go from there. I'm actually writing another book. The Norman book was just published, but I'm writing a book on the Vikings, which oddly enough is how the Norman book. I wasn't really intending to write a book on the Normans until the podcast really got underway. But of course, the Norman story begins in the Viking Age. And I have always been fascinated by the Vikings. My heritage obviously is Norwegian. I've always been fascinated by this time, and that got me thinking, about the Vikings. Maybe it's worth sort of telling this larger story that the Normans really are just a part of. And I was very fortunate to find an excellent publisher who was interested in both those stories, primarily actually the Viking one.
Really?
So that's how that came about. Yeah, he suggested a Viking book.
Yeah.
And when I told him about the Normans, he said, "Let's do that too." I said, "You've done most of the research. Let's do that first."
But I mean, you were talking about doing a Norman book for a number of years now, and
right.
So this is obviously the culmination of a lot of research that was done for the the podcast, but I understand you already had outlined a book at least before you
Yeah,
were, yeah,
yeah, and that's one of the things about podcasting that kind of took me by surprise. I mean, when we started this, obviously podcasts didn't exist, um, but with the Byzantine story, I was telling a story I was in love with,
yeah,
that I found endlessly fascinating, and I was almost kind of discovering it as I went along. I had done some reading, but certainly not exhaustive reading. I was, for example, very familiar with early Byzantine history, not at all familiar with late Byzantine history.
yeah,
And middle Byzantine history was kind of a mystery. Mystery, especially before the Macedonian dynasty. With the Normans, on the other hand, I did a whole lot of reading and a lot of thinking about what is the story here, what am I trying to tell through this before I started. So the Norman book is actually, you know, I did a whole not I mean I did a lot of reading for the Byzantine book as well, obviously, but the Norman book I really threw open the shelf and got information from all over before I started the podcast.
got it. Yeah, so behind you we see a bunch of Byzantine books, and I'm sure there's Norman books as well. So,
Well,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
the Norman section is that way. I mean, I do have to admit that the Byzantines, it's a love affair that is ongoing,
Yeah,
and I'm sure will.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, what was it? What was the point of writing this book? Is it to kind of anchor with the Byzantine thing at all, or are you just telling an interesting story?
The book actually began with a question. I had lunch with it was around Christmas, and I was thinking about what podcast to do next. And I met with my twin brother, and he asked me a question because I was talking about the Middle Ages, and especially the early Middle Ages. And he asked, how did Western Europe, which was so far behind its neighbors? I mean, if you were a betting man and could kind of go back and somebody asked you, place your bet on the civilization that you think is going to rise to global dominance. It would, unless you were a moron or you knew something, it wouldn't be the medieval West. They were scientifically behind. They were agriculturally behind. They were culturally behind. They were just dwarfed by the far more sophisticated and older cultures around them, the caliphates, Byzantium. You would think one of these or sophisticated cultures would win in the long run. Western Europe had so many disadvantages: politically divided, sinking populations, literacy plunging, and yet somehow it's Western Europe that becomes the dominant culture. Certainly of the 20th century and beyond. How did that happen? And the more I looked at that question and thought about the question, the more the Normans actually seemed to be, without trying to oversell my book here, the Normans really do seem to be at that hinge of history, that intersection where Europe goes from behind and defensive to offensive and confident. Just as an example, when this period starts in the 9th century, so the year 800, Europe is declining in population and they're being invaded from every side. The Muslims are coming through Spain and, of course, putting pressure on the Byzantines. The the Magyars are coming in from Central Europe, and then, of course, the Vikings are coming down from the north. And there is, in all of Europe, there's one sort of strong, stable state, and that's the Carolingian Empire, Charlemagne. it gets ripped apart by the Vikings. It totally gets sabotaged by the Vikings and a couple of other factors. Europe is a disaster at that point. Now fast forward to the year 1200. The Normans have run their course. Instead of a patchwork of countries, you have a strong country, Great Britain and bits of France in the north. France itself has become more solidified by the process, and then southern Italy and Sicily. In Spain, the Reconquista has begun. In the east, the Crusades have begun. Europe is sort of exporting its military strength, and it's far more confident. And I really think the Normans are at the center of all of these key developments.
So they just, go. When you think of that, normally you think, like when you think of a big stabilizing force, generally they tend to hang around for potentially thousands of years. Though that doesn't seem to be the case with the Normans. I mean, they're not called the Normans. Right,
yeah, that's the interesting. That's the other interesting thing about them. They disappear very quickly. They were never, even the original Normans in Normandy, they were always a minority of the populations they governed. Vikings settle in France, in the Northmen's duchy. Most of the population is, what we would call French. They adopt, and they have this. Their particular genius is this ability to absorb the best of what they've, the lands they've conquered, but add to it sort of their own energy and the best of their traditions. They're very malleable. They're adaptable. But of course, that very adaptability makes you disappear over time, because if you're constantly changing and constantly kind of absorbing, you eventually get absorbed. Yeah. And then that's why it's hard. Like, what is a Norman? Yeah. Is it someone who's British? Is it someone who's French? Is it someone who's Italian? Is it someone who's Syrian? North African? The answer is yes, in a way, to all of them, because they were in all of these places. But it's also no. Who are the Normans? Well, they're, in a way, kind of an invented people. They have a national, or not a national, they have an identity of their own, but it's always changing. So when it occurs in England, it's different than it is in Italy and Sicily and wherever else they go. So I think, yeah.
So I was going to say, so you think of France and you think of Britain. You don't really think of Italy, and you certainly are not thinking Syria and North Africa. And so what happened there?
Right. I mean, the Normans, in a way, they've kind of been the victim of one of their greatest successes, the conquest of England, William the Conqueror. And the other extraordinary fact is the Normans essentially have one great burst of conquest. At the very same time William is conquering England, Robert Guiscard and Roger are conquering southern Italy and Sicily, launching invasions of the Byzantine world, conquering Malta, going into North Africa, and then their son, Guiscard's son, goes to Syria. The only one that's remembered really is the conquest of England, both because England's importance, I think, in history, as well as England is the only time the Norman duchy, with all the resources of the duchy, kind of commits itself to an invasion. The rest, William, the famous saying is he overthrew the strength of England in one day. It's not true, but it's the Battle of Hastings. That's the only kind of serious native, at least in the public consciousness. That's the only resistance. He's crowned king on Christmas Day, and of course the Norman rule in England sticks. The current monarch is a descendant, so this is obviously a very important thing. in the south, it took 30 years to conquer Sicily. It was piecemeal, slow, one battle, one victory at a time, and it was never sort of one climactic battle, boom, it's over, there's a kingdom. This was something that happened over time, and I think because of that, it's less spectacular. You have this romantic story of King Harold and the arrow in the eye and the doomed king and Harold Hardrada running around the north. It's all very romantic. It's wonderful. The corresponding 30-year march slog through Sicily doesn't quite have the same emotional grip.
Yeah.
Which is a shame, because in some ways the conquest of the South and the kingdom they set up has just as many repercussions for, or maybe not just as many, but similar important repercussions for the development of the modern world. You think of democracy and Runnymede and the Magna Carta, but you should also think of Roger II, creating a written constitution, the Constitution of Melfi. That's, a written constitution is the rage of the Enlightenment. That's our own, the United States Constitution. All countries that have written constitutions, really derive from this.
Yeah.
So it's time they get their due, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So these guys are possibly. I remember with the 12 Byzantine rulers with Lost to the West, you were almost arguing that the Byzantines saved civilization, Western civilization. Would you also say that the Normans kind of had a very strong, important hand in that?
I don't think they. I guess you could argue that they saved Western civilization in the sense that Europe kind of goes on the offensive thanks to the Normans. But I don't think I would go as far as to say they. I think they were very important, but I don't think they by themselves created the modern world or saved Western civilization. I just think they are more important than they are credited with. And certainly the southern Normans have kind of been forgotten. They've been overlooked by the northern Normans. And so that's the reason why in the book and in the podcast, I really do focus more on the South than I do on the conquest of England. And I am endlessly fascinated by William the Conqueror and King Harold and his successors, even the Plantagenets. But I think it's so correspondingly well known compared to the southern Normans that I really wanted to concentrate more in the South. Yeah.
So other books, I guess, are written about the North and things going on in the North, and this is a balance to it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
At least I hope. I hope. I think in order to evaluate the Normans' place in history, you have to know the whole story.
Yeah.
And so I think the northern story is very important, but I want to tell the whole story so that you can evaluate, what is their importance. Obviously, I think they were vitally important in the development of Europe, from the papacy to the creation of modern kingdoms to the written constitution, toward the much later growth of democracy. If you're looking for a Renaissance outside of the Byzantine Empire and before the Italian Renaissance, you can find it, in Palermo, somewhat under Roger II, but under Frederick II as well. They were men before their time. And I think people need to know that story.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how do you get these ideas about what next to study, if not from your sort of looking at somebody who came marauding into the Byzantine world? And what I'm getting at is, I think you were in Sicily at one point. do travels have anything to do with what gets you excited about a certain history? And maybe a second question: what do you think? What do you think about traveling for all the listeners and readers of your books and all your material? Do you think that's important to understand the different civilizations?
Yeah, I mean those are huge questions, and I would say for me, it has been, as far as like picking what the next podcast is going to be or the next book or whatever. It's an embarrassment of riches. The problem is not, what's something interesting I can study. It's one of narrowing down, which one of these fascinating topics am I going to, get to dive into next. I've been fascinated by the ancient Near East. I would love to do something like that. I love the Middle Ages. I love the classical world. The Etruscans. I think there's so much that can still be said about all of this. It's just a matter of, what. In the Normans case, for example, I was asked a question and it got me thinking, and that's what. So I kind of do, like, one thing does lead into the next. The Byzantines lead into the Normans lead into the Vikings. But that's how it's worked so far. I'm not sure that that's always the way it's going to work. I mean, I would love to just sort of rewind and do a history of the Near East, the ancient, and sort of fill in the gaps, up until the Byzantines or the Romans.
Yeah.
The second question, I think, physically going there and seeing it, going to Constantinople and entering the Hagia Sophia is an education in itself. And I think that is so important to history. And here in America, in the United States, it's difficult sometimes to really appreciate history if you can't, because we don't have castles, we don't have Renaissance sculptures and cathedrals and all the rest here, at least not that date from that time. I think touching it, feeling it, tasting it, smelling it, seeing it, there's nothing like that. I think in history it's very easy, especially as it's written by historians, it's easy to overlook geography and the personal. I was talking with my twin brother today, and he was talking about Franklin Pierce, and Franklin Pierce is not remembered. He just read a biography. Pierce is not remembered as a good U.S. president. He made, or even as a president, he made plenty of mistakes. And he was telling me how on just before his inauguration, as he's going toward Washington to become president, there's an accident. He's had 3 sons. 2 of them have died. So his only remaining son, who he is sort of running to be president because it would provide a good example for his son. There's a train accident. His son is killed, his only son, and his wife goes into a severe depression and never really trusts him again. This is on the way to the inauguration. That's going to impact, seriously impact your performance. And I think it's so easy to open up a textbook, Franklin Pierce, Bleeding Kansas, move on.
Yeah.
But it's important, if you really want to understand it and therefore derive the proper lessons and make this worthwhile, the study of history worthwhile, I think you need to take into account both the human story, if you can, and the physical place.
Mm-hmm. So going there is really important. Can you give us a quick discussion of your first time into the Hagia Sophia? Talking about Byzantine.
Right.
When were you
there?
Remember
that. It was yesterday. I walked through. We got there. It was a tour. It was back in 2001, and I couldn't contain myself, so I ran down And I decided I'm going to find it myself, because we were staying in a hotel that I looked on a map, didn't seem that far away. So I was running through the streets of Istanbul, and I turned a corner, and I was in the Hippodrome. And I was looking up. I mean, I must have looked like a lunatic, sort of looking around, and I couldn't believe. I was so excited, walking down past the German fountain, and there's the Hagia Sophia. And it was closed, so I couldn't get into it. But I just stood there, you know. It felt like a second, but I think it was more like 20 or 30 minutes. I just stood there kind of walking around it, and these two Turkish men came up, and they started a conversation, and I was very naive. So I ended up going back to their shop. They tried to sell me a carpet. You know, so I politely declined, you know, and then the next day, at early in the morning, we went down, bought tickets, and entered it. And I'll never forget the feeling. I had read, you know, Justinian saying, "Solomon, I have surpassed you. I know that much of the decorations are gone. This is a building that's sinking and sagging and has seen all the vicissitudes of history." And yet, you know, when the Russians first entered the church, they said, "I don't know if I'm in heaven or on earth." And that's what I felt like. The grandeur of that building cannot be described in a book.
Yeah.
That's one you have to see it. The way you hear your echoes, the smell of the building, the cavernous interior. That's where the veil gets peeled back, and you're looking at Byzantium at its height.
Yeah.
Nowhere else that I have been is that true.
Yeah. Now, I know there's not a building like that, you know, in the Norman history, at least that I'm aware of. Is there any area? I mean, you were in Sicily, and you've been, you know, kind of all over the place in Europe. Is there anywhere that you would go for that kind? Certainly, maybe not that strong of an experience, but anything like that for the Normans?
Yeah, absolutely. In Sicily, the Church of Monreale, there's actually several Norman churches, but it's built in the Byzantine style. There's, you know, it's gold covered, kind of like St. Mark's, you know, with all kinds of these beautiful decorations. The thing I think sums why you can really get a sense of Roger II's Sicily is there's a mosaic of him. And there's mosaics, obviously in the Byzantine style. So the Greek population, this is kind of like a Byzantine church. But the more you look at it, the more you realize, not that something's off, but that this actually isn't a Byzantine church. It looks like a Byzantine church, and there's lots of elements of Byzantium. But you look up, and you know, near the ceiling, there's an Arabic inscription. And above, you have Roger II being crowned by Christ, and above him are the words Rogerius Rex, which are Latin and Greek, you know, for King Roger. So there you have the Latin of the Normans, the Greek, you know, dominant Byzantine of the Greek population, but you also have the Arabic representative, and some of the motifs on the columns are Arabic as well. So it's this beautiful blend of these three, you know, the three principal cultures that came together, and I think really made Roger II's Sicily something special. You know, and that relationship, it wasn't always harmonious, but it comes together here in a beautiful way that I think, again, there's a building, it's written in stone and gold and jewels. I think that right there is better than any book or any, you know, any will or testament that he could have left or any big sign about how great he is. That building, I think, sums up the brilliance of Norman Sicily more succinctly and profoundly than a library of books.
So you just have to go.
You have to. I think that's one of the things you have to go.
Yeah.
You know, if you're interested in the Byzantine period, Go to Istanbul, go to Ravenna, go to Venice. Go if you can, go see it for yourself. And in the Normans, the beauty of the Normans is, hey, pick where you want to go in Europe, in North Africa, in Antioch. Go to Antioch.
Yeah.
I would strongly suggest, as my old history teacher once said to me, there are two things I have never regretted spending money on: books and travel. And she's right. She's right.
Yeah. Well, so where did you get the? We're running low on time here, but just very quickly, where did you get the spark? So you mentioned a teacher. Have you always been interested in history and sort of stories from the old days and how things were, or?
Yeah, I mean, I really had great teachers, but my earliest memories, I loved reading Greek and Norse myths, and I loved history. My name is Etruscan, and so even at a young age, I was fascinated by these mysterious Etruscans, and the fact that we don't know really about them that much. They're kind of a lost people. That makes them a little more, I don't know what it is, but I love lost history. I love finding out how things fit together and how things we do now and the reasons we do them now aren't just kind of just made up. There are reasons for this, and knowing the history behind it is so fast. You can look around at the world and understand it in a much better way if you have an appreciation and if you know the story. I also think history is, who doesn't love a story? Who doesn't love a story? And I think history should be everyone's favorite subject. I know,
Yeah.
All right, he's a historian, he's a history teacher, of course he's going to say that. But no matter what you love, if you like math, study about Euclid, and there's a history of whatever you love.
Yeah.
There's a history of it, and to learn how things fit together, it should be everyone's favorite subject. I think part of the reason it's not is it is too often presented sort of in a dry names, dates,
Yeah.
that kind of fashion. The old saying is you like history in spite of school, and I'm not sure that that's true, but I think there is some truth to that.
Yeah.
And that's a shame.
So in our last question, really quick, the Vikings. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Maybe when it might come out, or anything you want to add about that?
Yeah, the Vikings. I have. It's been a long time since I've been as excited about something as writing about the Vikings. This is the perfect storm for me of interests coming together. I'm still in the research phase, which is I have to rein myself in. I'll just put it that way. But I'll write it by over the summer, and then so by next August it'll be out.
Wow. Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Looking forward to it. So the research. I can tell. You were doing Norse mythology back when you were a kid. So this is I can see why that's kind of bringing you back around, right? So this is probably
Right.
the most fun part of the project, I would imagine, kind of plumbing the depths of all the
Yeah.
stories and everything.
Yeah, and of course I'll have to travel to Norway.
I think so.
Research.
Yes, for research purposes.
I love reading about it. I read about this for fun anyway, so to have a purpose behind it is, it's like a kid in a candy shop, and you tell them your job is to tell me which is the best tasting candy.
Yeah.
It's
Sounds
it's
like a
not
pretty
bad.
good gig.
It's not bad. I'm not complaining.
Well, fantastic. Thanks a lot for doing this Q&A.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions. It's fun.
Yeah. We'll post this video online, hopefully on YouTube, get it up at some point, and
All right.
others can check it out. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks a lot.
All right. See ya.
Bye-bye.